In the silent chambers beneath the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets have waited for millennia to tell their story. Among them, one collection of Akkadian texts speaks of something that scholars have long dismissed as myth: a machine left by beings called the Anunnaki, still humming in the depths of the earth. Tonight, we journey through the cradle of civilization, tracing translations that mainstream archaeology has overlooked, examining geological anomalies that defy explanation, and asking a question that has haunted researchers for decades. What if the gods of ancient Sumer weren't gods at all, but engineers? What if they left something behind, something still running, still waiting, still watching from the darkness below? In the hour before dawn, when the stars still reign over the desert, and the sand holds the memory of nights, cold breath, the land between the rivers, lies in perfect silence. And this is Mesopotamia. This is Sumer. This is the cradle of everything we call civilization. And if you were to stand here 6,000 years ago, you would see something impossible. A world being born with cities rising from the marshes and irrigation channels spreading across the floodplain, like the veins of a vast body, and temples climbing toward the sky, each one a statement of purpose, declaring, "We are here. We are awake. We are reaching for something beyond ourselves and everywhere." The soft marks pressed into clay, those wedge-shaped impressions that captured thought itself, that made the fleeting permanent, that allowed the present to speak to the future across chasms of this time that no voice could cross alone. And this was cuneiform, the first writing, the first magic, and before Rome, before Greece, before Egypt reached its golden age, there was Sumer, rising from the mud and the reeds between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where humanity first learned to write, to calculate, to look up at the stars and wonder. And in this land, they wrote of beings who came from the sky, beings they called the Anunnaki, who descended to Earth in the time before memory and taught humanity everything it would need to build a world. And the story of how we came to know this ancient civilization is itself a tale of wonder and patience, and the slow revelation of secrets buried beneath millennia of sand and forgetting, for it was in the 19th century that European adventurers first began to dig into the mounds that dotted the Iraqi landscape, those strange hills that the local people called tells, which were not natural formations at all, but the accumulated layers of cities built upon cities, each generation raising its homes upon the ruins of the last, until mountains of human history rose from the plains. And among these early excavators was a man named Austin Henry Layard, who in the 1840s began to uncover the palaces of the Assyrian kings at Nimrud and Nineveh. And what he found astounded. The world for here were massive stone sculptures of winged bulls and bearded kings, and walls covered in carved reliefs depicting battles and hunts and religious ceremonies. And among these treasures were thousands upon thousands of clay tablets covered in the strange wedge-shaped writing that no one could yet read. And these tablets were shipped back to the British Museum, where they waited in wooden crates and dusty storage rooms for someone to unlock their secrets. And that someone came in the form of scholars who painstakingly compared the unknown script to inscriptions found on a cliff face at Behistun in Persia, where the ancient King Darius had carved his proclamation in 3 languages, including Old Persian, which scholars could partially understand. And through decades of careful work comparing signs and sounds and meanings, These dedicated linguists slowly cracked the code of cuneiform, revealing that these tablets contained not just the records of Assyrian kings, but the literature and laws and religious beliefs of civilizations far older than Assyria itself, reaching back to the Akkadians and before them to the Sumerians who had invented writing itself more than 5,000 years ago. And as the 20th century dawned and archaeologists like Leonard Woolley excavated the ancient city of Ur, uncovering the spectacular royal tombs with their golden treasures and their evidence of human sacrifice, the full scope of Mesopotamian civilization began to emerge, and with it came more tablets, always more tablets, hundreds of thousands of them. Eventually, each one a message from the deep past, written by scribes who could never have imagined that their words would survive to be read by people living in a world beyond their wildest dreams. And yet, here is a truth that few people realize, for of all those tablets recovered from the sands of Iraq, perhaps 10% have been fully translated and studied, while the rest sit in museum basements and university archives, waiting their turn with specialists who have too little time and too little funding to work through. The backlog, and among those unstudied tablets, there may be secrets we have not yet discovered. And among those that have been translated, there are passages that scholars have debated for generations, passages that seem to describe things that should not exist in texts. So ancient. And it is these passages that draw us deeper into our story tonight. For within the great literary works of ancient Mesopotamia, we find references that have puzzled and divided researchers for decades. Texts like the Atrahasis epic, which tells of the creation of humanity by the gods and of a great flood sent to destroy the world. Texts like the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which describes the ordering of the cosmos and the establishment of divine rule, and texts like the various hymns and administrative records that mention in passing things that seem utterly out of place. Devices and mechanisms and instruments that served the Anunnaki in ways that sound less like mythology and more like engineering. And one phrase that appears repeatedly in these texts is Din, which has been translated as the abode of the righteous ones or the place of the gods. And this Din, this divine dwelling, is described as a place where the Anunnaki worked and rested and operated their various instruments. And some researchers have noticed that within these descriptions of the Din, there are references to things that hum and glow and turn, without ceasing things that produce light, without flame and sound, without voice and power, without any visible source. And when we look at the specific Akkadian words used in these passages, we find terminology that does not easily map onto natural phenomena. Words that scholars have struggled to translate because they seem to describe artificial devices rather than organic beings or natural forces. And the controversy over these passages has been ongoing for decades, with mainstream academia generally dismissing the technological interpretations as anachronistic projections of modern concepts onto ancient minds, while a smaller community of researchers has argued that perhaps we should take the ancient scribes at their word and consider the possibility that they were describing exactly what they said. They were describing machines built by beings more advanced than themselves, machines that performed functions beyond human capability, machines that in some cases were left running to serve purposes that the scribes themselves may not have fully understood. And this brings us to the central question of our journey. Tonight, the question that has haunted this small community of researchers for decades. What if the scribes of ancient Akkad were not writing poetry or myth, but recording as best they could actual technology they had witnessed? And what if, somewhere beneath the sands of Iraq, something still hums in the darkness? A machine left running by beings who departed long ago, waiting to be found, waiting to be understood. And the pattern of machine-like language across multiple texts is difficult to dismiss once you begin to notice it. For we find references to the heart that beats without blood, and the voice that speaks without mouth, and the eye that sees across great distances, and the hand that moves without being touched. And these phrases appear not just in the grand mythological epics, but in administrative texts and temple inventories, and priestly in instructions where the scribes seem to be describing actual objects in actual locations that required actual maintenance and care. And mainstream archaeology has largely avoided engaging with these interpretations, preferring to translate these puzzling passages as metaphors for divine power or poetic descriptions of natural phenomena. And there are reasonable arguments for this caution, for it is all too easy to project our modern technological imagination onto ancient texts and see what we want to see rather than what is actually there. And yet, the persistence of this specific type of language across so many different text types and time periods gives pause to those who study these materials closely. And tonight, we will explore this mystery together, examining the texts themselves, considering the various interpretations following the clues. That may point to locations where something ancient and unexplained might still remain, and we will do so with open minds, acknowledging the uncertainty that surrounds all of this, while also allowing ourselves to wonder, what if, for that is the spirit in which the ancient scribes themselves wrote their tablets looking up at the stars that wheeled overhead, wondering who had put them there, wondering who had taught their ancestors the secrets of writing and building and measuring, wondering whether the gods who had departed might one day return and find their machines still running, still waiting, still performing their mysterious work in the darkness beneath the earth. And so we begin our search, following the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay by hands that turned to dust millennia ago, seeking the truth about what the Anunnaki may have left behind when they departed from this world, and whether somewhere beneath our feet in chambers, sealed since before the flood, something continues to turn in the darkness, humming with purpose, counting the centuries waiting for the moment of its rediscovery. And as we proceed through this night, let us hold in our hearts the same wonder that filled the scribes who first recorded these mysteries. The wonder that fills us still when we contemplate the vastness of time and the depths of human forgetting, and the possibility that our ancestors knew things, that we have lost things that wait patiently in the darkness to be remembered once more. To understand what the ancient scribes were trying to tell us, we must first understand the tools they used to speak across time. And this brings us to the languages themselves, to Akkadian and its predecessor Sumerian, two tongues that shaped the very foundation of human written expression. Sumerian stands alone in the family of human languages, what linguists call a language isolate, meaning it has no known relatives, no cousins, no ancestors we can trace. It emerged fully formed in the archaeological record like a gift left on the doorstep of history. And this alone has puzzled scholars for generations, because languages do not simply appear, They evolve, they branch, they connect to other tongues through webs of shared vocabulary and grammar. Yet Sumerian connects to nothing. It stands solitary and strange, the first written language and perhaps the most mysterious. Akkadian came later, a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic and Aramaic. And when Akkadian speakers rose to power in Mesopotamia, they did not abandon Sumerian, but instead absorbed it, learned it, preserved it the way medieval European scholars preserved Latin. And so, for centuries, the two languages existed side by side, with scribes trained in both, creating bilingual texts that would later prove essential for modern translation efforts. The writing system they shared, cuneiform, takes its name from the Latin word for wedge, because that is what each mark resembles. A small wedge pressed into soft clay with a reed stylus, and the system itself is remarkably complex, combining elements that work like an alphabet representing sounds, with elements that work like hieroglyphics representing entire words or concepts, and a single symbol might function one way in one context and differently in another. Which means that reading cuneiform is never simply a matter of looking up symbols in a dictionary, but rather an intricate act of interpretation that requires understanding context, grammar, literary tradition, and sometimes the personal quirks of individual scribes who lived and died 4,000 years ago. Modern scholars have spent over a century and a half developing our understanding of these languages, beginning with the decipherment of the Behistun inscription in the 1830s and continuing through the present day, with new tablets still being translated, new vocabulary still being discovered, new meanings still being debated in academic journals and conference halls. And yet, despite all this effort, there remain words that resist easy translation, terms that scholars argue about, new concepts that do not map cleanly onto anything in our modern experience. These troublesome words tend to cluster around certain topics, around descriptions of the gods and their activities, around references to their dwellings and their instruments, around the things that made the Anunnaki powerful and distinct from ordinary humans. And it is precisely in these contested spaces of translation that our story takes its most intriguing turn. Consider the Sumerian word me, pronounced as a single syllable like the English word may, a term that appears throughout the ancient texts in contexts that have baffled translators for over 100 years. Mainstream scholarship has rendered me variously as divine decree, divine power, fundamental cosmic principle, cultural norm, and office of civilization, are treating it as an abstract concept, representing the essential properties that make civilized life possible. The me of kingship, the me of priesthood, the me of writing, the me of music, all the arts and institutions that elevate human society above mere animal existence. This interpretation is not unreasonable, given certain contexts where the word appears, yet it fails to account for the remarkably physical way the texts actually describe these me. Because in the famous story of Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna visits the god Enki in his underground temple, gets him drunk on beer, and then proceeds to take the me from him, loading them onto her boat, carrying them physically away while Enki awakens from his stupor and sends servants to retrieve what was stolen. And in this narrative, the me are clearly objects, things that can be held and carried and transported across water, things that have weight and take up space, not abstract principles, but tangible items that confer specific capabilities upon whoever possesses them. The text lists these ME with remarkable specificity: the ME of lordship, the ME of godship, the ME of the exalted crown, the ME of the throne of kingship, the ME of the scepter, the ME of the royal insignia, the ME of the exalted shrine, the ME of shepherdship, the ME of kingship, the ME of lasting ladyship, the ME of divine lady, the ME of the office of Ishib priest, the ME of the office of Lumar priest, the ME of the office of Guda priest, the ME of truth, the ME of descent into the netherworld, the ME of ascent from the netherworld, and the list continues with dozens more specific capabilities, each one apparently stored in or represented by some physical object that could be transferred from one being to another. Some researchers looking at this pattern have proposed a radical reinterpretation, suggesting that MI might better be understood as devices, instruments, or what we might today call technology, objects that confer specific abilities upon their users, not through magic or divine favor, but through some functional mechanism we do not yet understand. And while mainstream archaeology dismisses such interpretations as anachronistic projection of modern concepts onto ancient minds, the physical language of the texts themselves seems to support reading ME as something more concrete than abstract cosmic principles. This pattern of physical, functional language extends to other terms that appear in the Anunnaki texts, words that have been translated in safely mundane ways, but which, in context, seem to describe something far more remarkable. The Sumerian word gir appears in texts describing objects associated with the gods, and standard dictionaries render it as dagger, sword, or ray of light. But certain passages describe the gir as something that travels through the sky, something that produces fire and thunder, something that the gods used to descend from and ascend to the heavens, leading some researchers to propose that gir in these specific contexts might describe some kind of vehicle or craft rather than a simple blade. The word mu presents similar challenges, conventionally translated as name when appearing in ordinary contexts, because in Sumerian thought, a name carried real power and presence. But in texts describing the activities of the gods, mu takes on different characteristics. It becomes something that can be ridden, something that flies, something that is shaped like a tall pointed object, something that the gods travel within. And the phrase Shem in later Semitic languages, derived from mu, would carry similar connotations of both name and sky vehicle in the interpretations of certain researchers. The compound term duar an kai, translated literally as bond of heaven and earth, appears in texts describing specific locations, particularly the temple complex at Nippur, which was considered the holiest site in Sumer. And conventional scholarship reads this as a poetic description of the temple as a meeting place between the divine and human realms, a spiritual nexus where prayers could reach the gods. But alternative readings note that the texts describe Dur and Ki with functional characteristics, as something that allows communication between realms, as something that must be maintained and protected, as something that was built and which could theoretically be destroyed, language that seems more consistent with a physical installation than a spiritual concept. Throughout these texts, we encounter phrases that scholars have translated in ways that minimize their strangeness. The stones that speak becomes oracular devices or acoustic phenomena. The metal that knows becomes well-crafted implements. The light that protects becomes divine radiance. The voice without mouth becomes metaphor for divine communication. each translation choice steering away from implications that would sound too technological, too specific, too much like descriptions of actual machines rather than poetic imaginings of divine power. And yet, when you read the texts in sequence, when you let the accumulating descriptions build their own picture without filtering each phrase through the assumption that these must be primitive metaphors, a different image begins to emerge, an image of specific devices performing specific functions in specific locations, devices created by beings who possessed knowledge that humans did not share. The texts that most directly concern our inquiry, the passages that describe what we are calling the machine, center on a location called the Abzu, a term that presents its own translation challenges and its own interpretive possibilities. Conventional scholarship translates Abzu as the primordial freshwater ocean. Other underground waters that the Sumerians believed existed beneath the earth and which fed the springs and rivers, the cosmic sea that existed before creation and which continued to flow beneath the visible world. And in mythology, the Abzu was the domain of Enki, the god of wisdom, magic, crafts, and fresh water, who built his temple above the Abzu and who drew power and knowledge from its depths. This reading is entirely consistent with the Sumerian understanding of hydrology, their awareness that water could be found by digging deeply enough, their observation that springs seem to emerge from underground sources, their practical knowledge of irrigation and the movement of water through the landscape. And most scholars consider the Abzu to be simply the Sumerian explanation for groundwater elevated to cosmic significance. Yet certain texts describe the Abzu in ways that do not quite fit this interpretation. Passages that speak of the Abzu as containing structures and installations, as being a place where things were kept and operations conducted, as being accessible through specific entrances that were guarded and restricted, as containing the ME that Enki possessed and from which his power derived, as producing sounds and lights that emerged from beneath the earth. In one particularly striking text, the Abzu is described as the place where Enki set the great turning, the continuous motion, the mechanism that maintains the order of the world. And while this can certainly be read as poetic description of cosmic harmony, the language carries a mechanical specificity that invites other interpretations. The text states that in the deep place, where waters are still, the heart of the Wise One continues its turning. Language that juxtaposes stillness and motion, that locates activity beneath the visible surface, that attributes ongoing function to something installed in the depths. The passage continues, stating it was set in motion in the days before the flood, and it shall turn until the stars return to their first positions. A time reference that links the installation to the epoch before the Great Deluge and projects its operation forward to some future astronomical alignment. The return of stars to their first positions, suggesting a grand cycle measured in millennia or longer. The text warns that those who approach without knowing will be struck by the light that protects, indicating that the installation had defensive capabilities. Some mechanism for harming those who came near without proper authorization or knowledge, and it promises that only those who carry the word or key or ME may enter and not be harmed, suggesting that access required possession of some specific object or knowledge that would disable or bypass the protective system. We must be careful here to acknowledge what we do not know and cannot prove, Because these translations remain contested, because the original texts are fragmentary and damaged, because any rendering from ancient Akkadian or Sumerian into modern English involves countless interpretive choices that shape the meaning that emerges. Because scholars who have devoted their lives to these languages would offer different readings that make the passages sound more mundane, more consistent with spiritual and mythological interpretation, are more like what we expect ancient peoples to have believed, rather than what we might secretly hope they knew. Yet the texts themselves, whatever they ultimately mean, describe something, and the question we must ask is not whether our interpretation is certainly correct, but whether it is possibly correct, whether the language of these ancient tablets could plausibly describe technology as well as theology, whether the scribes who pressed these wedge marks into clay 4,000 years ago were recording observations and knowledge rather than inventing pure fantasy. Consider 3 passages that illustrate the interpretive challenge we face, each one capable of being read in radically different ways depending on the translation choices we make. The first passage describes an object possessed by the god Ninurta and states in one translation that he held the divine radiance that shone in all directions and made darkness flee, language that sounds like a description of divine glory. Metaphorical light representing power and goodness, perfectly consistent with how we expect ancient peoples to speak about their gods. But the same passage translated with different choices reads that he held the device that projected light in all directions and dispelled darkness, language that sounds like a description of a lamp or beacon or searchlight, a physical object with a specific function, the work of engineering rather than divinity. The second passage describes the chamber of the gods and states in conventional translation that it was filled with the awesome radiance of divine power which no mortal could withstand, language that suggests overwhelming spiritual presence, the natural inability of humans to endure proximity to the holy. But an alternative translation reads that it was filled with the emission of the devices which no unprotected person could survive, language that suggests radiation or some other physically harmful output, a dangerous environment requiring shielding rather than a spiritually overwhelming one requiring moral purity. The third passage describes the ascent of a god to heaven and states conventionally that he rose in glory upon the divine wind to his dwelling in the sky. The language that evokes a spiritual being returning to a spiritual realm through metaphorical means. But translated differently, the same passage reads that he lifted off in the roar and fire of his sky chamber toward his station above, language that evokes a vehicle launch, a physical craft carrying a physical being to a physical destination in space. We cannot determine with certainty which readings are correct, and perhaps the very question misses something essential about how the ancient mind worked, how people who lived before the division between science and religion, before the separation of the material and spiritual, might have written in ways that encompassed both registers simultaneously, using language that was both metaphorical and literal, both spiritual and technological, in ways that our either-or thinking struggles to accommodate. What we can say is that the technological readings are not impossible. They are not ruled out by the grammar or vocabulary of the original languages. They require no more interpretive stretching than the conventional readings, and they have the virtue of offering a consistent explanation for why so many passages across so many texts describe the Anunnaki and their works in such physical, functional, mechanical terms. The scribes of ancient Akkad were not stupid people. They were not primitive minds incapable of distinguishing reality from fantasy. They were the educated elite of the most advanced civilization on Earth, trained in traditions of observation and record-keeping that would not be matched again for millennia. And when they wrote about the gods and their devices, they were writing either what they believed to be true or what they had been instructed to record by institutional traditions that traced back to the direct presence of the Anunnaki themselves. If we take their words seriously, if we resist the modern tendency to assume that ancient peoples could only have produced childish myths while reserving practical knowledge for ourselves, then we must grapple with the possibility that they were describing something real, something they had seen or been told about, something that continued to function beneath the earth long after the gods who made it had departed for destinations unknown. Whether we read these texts as poetry or as instruction, as myth or as memory, as the imaginings of primitive minds or the records of witnesses to wonders, one thing becomes clear across all the passages and all the translations and all the interpretive possibilities, and that is that the scribes were describing something specific. Not vague divine power, but particular devices. Not generalized holiness, but individual installations. Not spiritual realms accessible only through prayer and death, but physical locations that could be entered by those with the proper knowledge or equipment. Something that existed in a specific place beneath the city of Eridu, beneath the marshes of southern Mesopotamia, beneath the sands that have accumulated over 6,000 years of wind and silence. Something that, according to the texts, was designed to run forever, set in motion before the flood, maintained by mechanisms that required no human intervention, protected by systems that would destroy the unauthorized, continuing its turning through all the ages that humans have recorded and beyond, through centuries that saw the rise and fall of empires the scribes never imagined, through millennia that brought changes the gods themselves might not have foreseen, running and running and running in the darkness beneath. The question that remains is simple in its asking, and yet it has kept researchers awake for generations. It has drawn adventurers into the Iraqi desert. It has consumed careers and reputations and fortunes. It has hovered at the edge of archaeology like a dream that will not fade, no matter how firmly we insist we have awakened. And that question is simply this: after all the translations and all the interpretations and all the arguments about what the ancients really meant, the question that matters most is not whether they wrote about a machine, but whether that machine was real. And if it was real, then where? Where in the depths of the earth is the heart of the wise ones still turning, still waiting, still doing whatever work it was built to do in the ages before the flood, when the Anunnaki walked the earth and the line between God and engineer had not yet been drawn? In the great museums of the world, and in the clay tablets still buried beneath the sands of Iraq, there exists a record of beings who defy our modern categories of understanding. Beings who were neither quite gods in the ethereal sense we have come to expect, nor quite mortals in the limited way we understand ourselves. And these beings bore a name that has echoed through 6,000 years of human memory, a name that scholars have translated in various ways, but which carries at its heart a profound and unsettling meaning. They were called the Anunnaki, and in the Sumerian tongue, this name breaks apart into components that tell us something remarkable about how the ancient peoples understood them, Anu meaning heaven or the sky, Na meaning those who came down or descended, and Ki meaning earth or the ground beneath our feet, so that the name itself can be read as those who from heaven came down to earth, not spirits who dwelt in some abstract celestial realm, but travelers, visitors, beings who made a journey from one place to another and arrived here in this world of dust and rivers and marshland, where humanity was just beginning to open its eyes to consciousness itself. The Sumerian and Akkadian texts paint a picture of these beings that is startlingly consistent across thousands of tablets and across centuries of scribal tradition. And what emerges from this collective portrait is something far more complex and far more physical than the gods of later civilizations would become. For the Anunnaki, as described in these ancient sources, had bodies that required sustenance. They ate food and drank water and beer. They experienced fatigue and required rest. They felt emotions with an intensity that often led to conflict and intrigue among their ranks. They formed relationships and bore children and grew old, though their lifespans stretched across timescales that would seem like eternity to human observers. And, perhaps most significantly, they possessed knowledge and technology that set them apart from the humans who would come to serve them and eventually to worship them as divine. The pantheon of the Anunnaki was structured not unlike a royal court, or perhaps more accurately, like the governing body of a civilization that had developed complex hierarchies over vast periods of time. At the apex sat Anu, who dwelt in the heavenly realm and rarely descended to earth, but whose authority remained paramount in all matters of cosmic importance. Beneath him in the earthly domain, two figures held primary power, and their relationship would shape much of what followed. Enlil, the lord of the command who controlled the forces of the atmosphere and who represented order and authority, and the maintenance of the established way of doing things. And Enki, who was also called Ea, the lord of wisdom and the lord of the Abzu, the underground waters, who represented knowledge and craft and innovation, and who would play a central role in the stories of technology left behind. Around these three central figures moved a host of other beings, each with their own domains and responsibilities. Inanna, who was called Ishtar by the Akkadians, the Queen of Heaven associated with love and war, and the planet Venus. Utu, the sun god who saw all that happened in the daylight hours and who served as a figure of justice. Nana, the moon god whose cycles measured the months and the seasons. Ninhursag, the mother goddess associated with the earth and with fertility and with the shaping of living things. And many others whose names and functions filled the tablets with a sense of a vast and intricate civilization, operating according to rules and relationships that human scribes struggled to fully comprehend. What distinguished this pantheon from those that would come later in human history, from the gods of Greece or Rome or Egypt, or the divine figures of so many other traditions, was the remarkable physicality with which the Anunnaki were described. They did not float through existence as abstract principles or disembodied forces. They built things with their hands. They created tools and structures and systems. They traveled from place to place using conveyances that the texts describe in terms that have fascinated researchers for decades. They could be wounded and they could heal. They could be tricked and they could learn. They argued among themselves in councils where decisions were made through debate and persuasion, and sometimes through threats of force. And when they acted in the world, Their actions left physical traces, structures and artifacts and instructions that persisted long after any particular event had passed into memory. The Council of the Anunnaki appears repeatedly in the texts as a governing body that made decisions affecting both the divine realm and the human world below. And the descriptions of these councils have a procedural quality that reads less like religious mythology and more like the minutes of organizational meetings. Matters would be brought before the assembly. Arguments would be made on various sides. Votes would be taken or consensus would be reached. And edicts would be issued that then required implementation through specific actions and mechanisms. This is not how gods typically behave in the religious literature of humanity. This is how civilizations behave, how bureaucracies function, how advanced societies organize themselves to accomplish complex tasks. And this observation has led many researchers, both within and outside the mainstream, to wonder whether the ancient scribes were recording not theological abstractions, but actual memories of a civilization that once walked among humanity and left its mark upon our earliest development as a species. The question of what the Anunnaki actually did during their time on Earth leads us into territory that has sparked controversy for decades, but which deserves careful consideration regardless of where one ultimately lands on questions of interpretation. For the texts are remarkably specific about the knowledge and capabilities that these beings possessed and the ways in which they transferred aspects of that knowledge to humanity. And when we examine these accounts closely, a pattern begins to emerge that looks less like the miraculous interventions of supernatural deities and more like the systematic application of advanced technology and the deliberate education of a developing species. Consider first the gift of agriculture, which the texts attribute directly to the Anunnaki, and which they describe not as a sudden magical transformation, but as a process of teaching and demonstration. They taught the seed to know the season according to one text. They showed humanity which plants could be cultivated, and when to plant them, and how to channel the waters of the rivers to nourish the growing crops. They introduced the plough and the sickle and the grinding stone. They established the calendar that allowed the agricultural cycle to be predicted and planned. And all of this they did not through divine fiat, but through instruction, through the patient transmission of accumulated knowledge from those who possessed it to those who needed to learn. Consider the gift of writing which transformed human civilization more profoundly than perhaps any other single development. The cuneiform script that emerged in Sumer was not understood by the scribes themselves to be a human invention, but rather something that had been given. The stylus that made thought permanent came from the Anunnaki according to the traditions, and the earliest uses of writing were administrative rather than literary. They were tools for counting and cataloguing and keeping track of the complex operations that civilization requires. Writing was technology transferred from a more advanced source to a species that was ready to receive it. Consider astronomy, which reached levels of sophistication in ancient Mesopotamia that continue to astonish modern researchers. The Sumerians and their successors tracked the movements of the planets with remarkable precision. They developed mathematical systems capable of predicting celestial events centuries in advance. They mapped the stars and named the constellations in patterns that persist in our sky charts to this day. And they attributed this knowledge explicitly to the Anunnaki, who had mapped the wandering stars long before humanity had developed the capacity to lift its eyes from the immediate concerns of survival and wonder about the lights in the night sky. The texts speak of medicine, and what they describe sounds less like healing through prayer or magic, and more like systematic knowledge of how bodies function and how they can be repaired when damaged. The Anunnaki knew the secrets of the blood according to the ancient sources. They understood the internal workings of living creatures. They could intervene when disease or injury threatened life, and some of the procedures described in the medical texts that have survived suggest knowledge that should have been far beyond the capabilities of early human civilization, knowledge of anatomy and pharmacology, and surgical technique that seems to presuppose a foundation of understanding that had to come from somewhere. And then there is mining, the extraction of metals from the earth, which the texts describe as one of the primary activities of the Anunnaki during their time in this world. They went into the earth for the yellow metal, for gold, which they valued and required for purposes that the texts hint at but never fully explain. And the labor of mining was hard, and the Anunnaki themselves grew weary of it. And this weariness, according to the famous account in the Atrahasis epic, led directly to the creation of humanity itself, beings shaped to bear the burden of labor so that the gods might rest from their toil. This brings us to perhaps the most controversial aspect of the Anunnaki accounts, the creation of humanity as described in multiple texts that have survived the millennia. For the process described does not match the instantaneous creation by divine word that appears in later religious traditions. Instead, it reads like a procedure, a technical operation carried out by Enki and Ninhursag, working together with specific materials and specific steps: clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, gestation in artificial wombs, multiple attempts that produced beings that were not quite right before the final success. And the result was humanity, creatures made in the image of the Anunnaki, but smaller and shorter lived and designed to serve, to labor, to maintain the systems that the gods had built. Whether we read this as metaphor or as memory, as theological poetry or as garbled recollection of something that actually occurred, the pattern it establishes is consistent with everything else we find in the texts about the Anunnaki. They did not work magic. They performed procedures. They did not wish things into existence. They built them using knowledge and tools and techniques that followed rules. Their divine acts read like engineering projects. Their gifts to humanity read like technology transfer. Their most closely guarded secrets were not mystical formulas, but machines, devices, instruments that could accomplish what no amount of human effort alone could achieve. The texts tell us that the Anunnaki did not remain forever, that there came a time when they departed from the earth, and the circumstances of this departure are woven through with accounts of cataclysm and transformation that echo across the mythologies of cultures worldwide. The great flood that swept across the land and destroyed nearly everything that had been built. The selection of certain humans to survive and to carry forward the seeds of a new beginning. The aftermath in which humanity emerged into a world that had changed fundamentally, and in which the gods would no longer walk openly among their creations. The flood narratives of Mesopotamia are older than any others that have survived, older than the biblical account with which they share so many features, older than the Greek story of Deucalion or the Hindu account of Manu, and they preserve details that set them apart from mere tales of natural disaster. For the flood in these texts was not simply a catastrophe that happened, but an event that was known in advance, debated among the gods, prepared for through specific actions, and it serves in the narrative as a dividing line between two eras of existence: the time when the Anunnaki were present and active, and the time when humanity would largely be left to find its own way. Before the waters rose, the texts tell us that there was conflict among the Anunnaki about what would happen to their human creations. Enlil, who had grown weary of the noise and proliferation of humanity, sought to use the coming catastrophe as a means of elimination. But Enki, who had played the central role in creating humans and who felt a bond with them, chose to intervene, speaking to Ziusudra or Utnapishtim through the wall of a reed hut, instructing him to build a vessel, to gather the seeds of all living things, to preserve what could be preserved against the destruction that was coming. And this salvation was accomplished not through miracle, but through engineering, the construction of a craft according to specifications, the gathering of provisions, the navigation of waters that covered the face of the earth until the peak of a mountain emerged and solid ground could be found once more. In the aftermath of the flood, the texts describe a changed relationship between gods and humans. The Anunnaki did not simply resume their previous direct involvement in earthly affairs. Instead, they established intermediaries, priests and priestesses who would serve as points of contact, temples that would function as houses of the gods where rituals could maintain the connection even when the gods themselves were not physically present, and certain places were designated as special, as locations where the bond between heaven and earth remained strong, where communication might still be possible, where the presence of the divine had not entirely withdrawn. The ziggurat temples that rose across Mesopotamia in the millennia that followed were understood by their builders as connection points, artificial mountains that reached toward heaven and that served as places where the gods might descend when they chose to visit. And beneath these structures and within them were chambers and systems whose functions the priests maintained according to instructions passed down through generations, kept secret from ordinary humans, preserved as sacred knowledge that must not be lost. The promise that echoes through the texts is that the departure was not permanent, that the gods would return when certain conditions were met, when the great year completes according to one formulation, referring perhaps to astronomical cycles that span thousands of years, to alignments of planets and stars that would mark the appointed time. And until that return, humanity was charged with maintaining what had been established, keeping the knowledge alive, attending the sacred places, and, perhaps most significantly, ensuring that certain systems continued to function even if their purposes were not fully understood. What were these systems, and what were they meant to do? This is the question that leads us to the heart of our investigation, for among the instructions given to the priesthood, among the sacred duties that were to be maintained across generations, there appears to have been the responsibility of watching over something that the texts describe in terms that sound mechanical rather than mystical. A device or collection of devices buried in the deep place, in the Abzu where Enki had his domain, set in motion before the flood and designed to continue operating through all the years that would follow, performing functions that the texts hint at but never fully specify, and perhaps maintaining the connection between realms, perhaps keeping watch over the earth and its inhabitants, perhaps counting the years until the return that had been promised, perhaps doing something else entirely that we cannot even guess at from the fragments that survive. The machine was left running. This phrase, or variations of it, appears in multiple contexts, and it is accompanied by warnings about the consequences of interference, by descriptions of the protections that had been placed around it, by instructions for how the priesthood should conduct themselves in relation to it, without attempting to access or alter what they were charged with, merely preserving. And over the centuries and millennia that followed, as empires rose and fell, as the Akkadians succeeded the Sumerians, and were themselves succeeded by Babylonians and Assyrians, and Persians and Greeks, and all the others who claimed this land, the knowledge became fragmented, the understanding faded, the temples fell into ruin, and the priesthoods lost their way. And yet, somewhere beneath the accumulated layers of history, if the texts are to be believed, the machine continued its work, undisturbed by the chaos above, indifferent to the passing of human ages, doing whatever it was designed to do in the darkness far below the surface, where no one any longer remembered to look. The gods departed, and the waters receded, and humanity emerged into a world that had changed forever. A world where they would need to find their own way forward with only the fragments of knowledge that had been preserved and the distant hope that someday the teachers would return. The centuries became millennia, and the millennia accumulated into ages of history that saw the rise and fall of every civilization that tried to take root in that land between the rivers. And through all of it, the memory persisted in some form. In the texts that were copied and recopied by scribes who no longer fully understood what they were preserving, in the traditions that were passed down through priestly families, in the folk beliefs of common people who knew only that certain places were sacred or forbidden without knowing why, in the strange reports that would surface from time to time of sounds heard in the earth, of lights seen where no lights should be, of places where the ground itself seemed to hum with a vibration that had no natural source. Somewhere beneath their feet, if the texts are to be believed, something continued to operate, a machine left in darkness doing its work year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, through the time of the prophets and the time of the philosophers, through the rise of new religions that displaced the old, through the coming of conquerors who cared nothing for the secrets of the land they claimed, through the modern age with its oil wells and its wars and its technologies that would have seemed as magical to the ancient Sumerians as the works of the Anunnaki might seem to us, waiting in patience that only a machine can possess, running according to instructions given so long ago that the very language in which they were spoken has become a subject for scholarly reconstruction, maintaining systems whose purposes may have been forgotten, even by those who originally designed them, or perhaps still serving exactly the function that was intended, still counting down to an appointed time, still preparing for a return that was promised in the earliest days of human memory and that has never been explicitly cancelled. The darkness beneath Iraq holds many secrets, geological formations and underground rivers, and the buried remains of cities that flourished before history began to be written. And among those secrets, there may be something else, something that does not belong to the natural history of this world, something that was placed there by hands that came from somewhere beyond the sky, and that has continued its patient work through all the ages of human confusion and forgetting. The machine left running, the heart that beats without blood, the voice that speaks without mouth, the eye that watches without ever closing, the bond between heaven and earth that was never meant to be broken no matter how far the gods might travel or how long they might stay away. Perhaps it is still there, waiting to be found, waiting for the moment when someone with the right knowledge and the right tools and the right understanding of what the ancient texts were really trying to say finally penetrates to that deep place and stands in the presence of something that has been running since before the flood, since before the departure, since the very beginning of the human story as the Anunnaki understood it and as they wanted us to remember. If the texts speak true, then the machine must rest somewhere beneath the ancient soil of southern Iraq. And so we turn now to the search itself, to the patient work of those who have tried to read geography through the lens of mythology, and find in the modern landscape echoes of the antediluvian world. The Akkadian and Sumerian texts are remarkably specific when they describe the dwelling places of the gods, and no dwelling is described with more reverence or more technical detail than the E.Abzu, the temple of Enki that stood in the city of Eridu. The name itself tells us something profound. E.Abzu means house of the deep waters or house of the abyss, and it refers not merely to a temple that sat upon the earth, but to a structure that descended into the earth that connected the world above with the world below, that served as a bridge between now the realm of mortals and something far older and stranger beneath their feet. Eridu holds a special place in Mesopotamian memory, for the Sumerians themselves considered it the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven, the point where civilization itself began, and modern archaeology has confirmed at least part of this ancient claim. Excavations at Tel Abu Shahrain, the modern name for the Eridu site, have revealed layer upon layer of habitation stretching back to approximately 5,400 BCE, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in human history. But what interests us tonight lies not in what has been excavated, but in what remains hidden beneath the lowest levels that archaeologists have reached. There are structures that descend further than any excavation has gone. Chambers that were sealed in antiquity tunnels that lead into darkness and have never been fully explored. The texts tell us that Enki built his temple over the Abzu, over the deep place where the primordial waters resided. But when we read the descriptions more carefully, we find something curious. These waters do not behave like water. They are described as still and unmoving, yet somehow alive. They glow with their own light. They produce sounds that the priests could hear if they pressed their ears to the sacred floor, and at the heart of this underground realm, something turned, something worked, something continued its eternal function, while the temple above conducted its rituals, and the city around it lived and died and lived again. The Abzu may have been built not over an underground lake, but over something else entirely, something that the priests understood only as the domain of their god, but which may have been in reality the housing for a machine that Enki himself had set in motion. Consider the geography of southern Iraq, as it exists today, and as it existed in ancient times. This is a land of rivers and marshes, of underground aquifers, and hidden waterways beneath the surface lies a complex network of water-bearing strata limestone formations, honeycombed with caverns and channels carved over millions of years by the slow, patient work of underground rivers. The Mesopotamians knew these waters. They accessed them through wells and qanats. They understood that beneath the dry surface of their land lay another world, a wet and secret world, and they associated this underground realm with Enki, with wisdom, with the most ancient knowledge of all modern hydrogeologists, have mapped some of these underground systems using seismic surveys and satellite data, and they have found something intriguing in several locations, particularly in the region around Eridu. There are anomalies in the subsurface structure, void spaces that do not match the expected geological patterns, hollow areas that appear on instruments as pockets of emptiness where the surrounding earth should be solid. Some of these may be natural caverns formed by water dissolution of limestone, but others have shapes that seem too regular, edges that appear too straight, dimensions that suggest construction rather than erosion. Mainstream geologists explain these as artifacts of the imaging process, as misinterpretations of the data, as anything but what some researchers have proposed, that they might be the remnants of artificial underground chambers built by a civilization whose capabilities we have not yet understood. Let us move north from Eridu, following the ancient course of the Euphrates to the great city of Ur, where Leonard Woolley conducted his famous excavations in the 1920s and 1930s, uncovering the royal tombs with their treasures of gold and lapis lazuli, their evidence of human sacrifice, their silent testimony to a civilization of startling sophistication. Woolley explored the ziggurat of Ur, that great stepped pyramid dedicated to the moon god Nana, and he documented its construction, its massive mud brick core, its outer casing of baked brick set in bitumen, its three great staircases converging at the summit. But Woolley also noted something that has received far less attention than the treasures of the royal tombs beneath the ziggurat. He found tunnels, passages that descended into the earth and then stopped, blocked by debris or by deliberate sealing, or simply by the limits of what his team could safely explore in an era before modern excavation techniques. These tunnels were noted in his reports and then largely forgotten by subsequent researchers who were more interested in the artifacts above than the mysteries below. But the tunnels remain, and with them, the questions. What were they for? Where did they lead? What might still rest at their terminus? Waiting in the darkness for someone to break through the final barriers and see what the Ur of 4,000 years ago considered important enough to bury and protect beyond Ur. The marshlands of southern Iraq present another realm of mystery. Altogether, these wetlands, which stretch across the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates, have been home to the marsh Arabs for thousands of years, a people whose way of life has remained remarkably unchanged. Since Sumerian times, living in reed houses on floating islands, moving through the waters in narrow boats that resembled the vessels depicted on cylinder seals. From the 3rd millennium BCE, the marshes were severely damaged during the regime of Saddam Hussein, when drainage projects attempted to destroy both the ecosystem and the people who depended on it. But since 2003, efforts have been made to restore the waters, and with the returning floods have come stories from the marsh Arabs themselves. Stories they had kept quiet during the years of persecution. Stories about places in the marshes where the water behaves strangely, where it seems to glow at night, where sounds emerge from beneath the surface as if something below were breathing or humming or speaking in a language no human can understand. These are folk tales. Of course, and scientists would rightly point out that marsh gases can create unusual visual effects, that underwater acoustic phenomena can produce eerie sounds, that the human mind is prone to finding patterns and meaning where none exist. All of this is true, and yet the specificity of the stories, their localization to particular spots that remain consistent across generations of telling their correlation with the ancient texts that describe Enki moving through the waters of the Abzu. All of this gives us pause and makes us wonder whether beneath the marshes, as beneath the tells, something waits. And to the east, the Zagros Mountains rise like a wall between the Mesopotamian plain and the Iranian plateau. And here too, the texts give us hints of underground places of caverns where the gods retreated, of tunnels that connected the surface world with realms below. The mountains are limestone, and limestone means caves. And the caves of the Zagros are extensive, complex, and largely unexplored. Some of these caves show evidence of human occupation stretching back tens of thousands of years into the Paleolithic. But others have never been entered by modern researchers, blocked by rockfalls or flooded passages, or simply too remote and difficult to access. In a region where political boundaries and military conflicts have made sustained scientific work nearly impossible, the texts speak of the Kur, the mountain land, as a place of both danger and wonder, where the gods maintained facilities, where precious metals were extracted, where certain machines were housed away from the lowland cities, in locations that could be sealed and protected and forgotten until they were needed again. We do not know if any of these mountain caves contain what the texts describe, but we know that they have not been adequately searched, and in the absence of evidence, we cannot rule out the possibility that evidence exists, waiting in the darkness of a cave that no modern human has entered. Now we must speak of the anomalies themselves, the discoveries that do not fit comfortably into our conventional understanding of what ancient Mesopotamia was capable of producing. And foremost among these is the object known as the Baghdad Battery, discovered in 1938 in the village of Kujut Rabu, near Baghdad, and now lost during the looting of the Iraq Museum. In 2003, the device consisted of a clay jar approximately 15 centimeters tall, containing a copper cylinder within which was suspended an iron rod. The components were held in place by an asphalt plug, and the configuration is precisely what would be needed to create a simple galvanic cell when filled with an acidic solution such as vinegar or grape juice. The device could generate approximately 1 volt of electricity. Mainstream archaeologists have offered various explanations, suggesting the object was a storage vessel for sacred scrolls, or a container for some unknown purpose that merely happens to resemble an electrical device. But when researchers have constructed replicas and tested them, the replicas work, they generate electricity. And while 1 volt is not much, it would be enough to power small devices to create electroplating effects, or to serve some ritual purpose that we do not fully understand. One battery alone proves nothing, but the questions it raises are significant if the ancients understood electrochemistry. What else did they understand? What other devices might they have built, and what might those devices have been designed to do? Consider, too, the acoustic properties of certain ancient structures, properties that seem too precise to be accidental in the great hypostyle halls of Egypt, and in certain Mesopotamian temple remains. Researchers have documented resonance frequencies that match human vocal ranges, as if the structures were designed to amplify particular tones to create standing waves of sound that would fill the space with vibration when people describe the hum of ancient sites. This acoustic engineering may be part of the explanation, but it does not explain everything. Some sites produce sounds without any apparent source vibrations that emerge from the earth itself. Frequencies that instruments detect, but that have no obvious origin. Mainstream science attributes these to piezoelectric effects in the stone-to-underground water movement, to distant seismic activity, and these explanations may be correct, but they do not account for the fact that the ancients specifically described certain places as speaking, as singing, as producing voices from below. If they were merely hearing natural geological sounds, why did they attribute these sounds to their gods? Why did they build temples precisely over the locations where the sounds were loudest? Why did they describe the sounds as meaningful as messages, as communications from the divine? The great example that captures the world's imagination is, of course, the Sphinx of Giza, beneath whose pores seismic surveys have detected hollow chambers that the Egyptian government has never permitted to be excavated. This is not Mesopotamia, but the parallel is instructive, a structure of immense antiquity, beneath which instruments detect empty spaces, authorities that refuse to investigate, and legends that insist something important lies hidden below. We see the same pattern in Iraq, where ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted before and after the 2003 invasion detected anomalies beneath several ancient sites. Anomalies that were noted in classified reports and then seemingly forgotten, as more pressing concerns consumed the attention of those who might have explored them. Construction workers rebuilding infrastructure. In the years following the invasion, sometimes broke through into underground chambers, tunnels that appeared on no map spaces that had clearly been constructed rather than formed naturally. In most cases, these discoveries were reported filled in and never investigated properly. The chaos of reconstruction, the danger of unexploded ordnance, the priority of restoring basic services, all combined to ensure that archaeological mysteries took a distant second place to survival. And so, the tunnels remain sealed and the questions remain unanswered. And the machines, if machines there be, continue their work in darkness. Modern technology offers tools that could revolutionize our understanding of what lies beneath Iraq, if only the tools could be properly deployed. Satellite archaeology has already transformed the field, revealing the outlines of ancient cities and canal systems that cannot be seen from the ground, allowing researchers to map sites without ever visiting them, and identifying locations that merit further investigation. Synthetic aperture radar can penetrate the surface to detect buried structures. Multispectral imaging can identify chemical signatures that indicate human activity. Ground-penetrating radar can create detailed three-dimensional models of subsurface features. LiDAR can strip away vegetation to reveal hidden topography. All of these technologies exist, and all of them have been applied in limited ways to Mesopotamian sites. But the full potential of modern remote sensing has never been realized in Iraq, for reasons that are as political as they are practical. Sustained archaeological work requires stability, and stability has been in short supply in Iraq for decades. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the Gulf War of 1991, the sanctions years of the 1990s, the 2003 invasion and its aftermath, the rise and fall of ISIS. Each crisis has disrupted research, destroyed records, dispersed the archaeologists who knew the sites best and created conditions in which looting has flourished, while legitimate excavation has stagnated. The great irony is that we know more about the surface of Mars than we know about what lies beneath the tells of southern Iraq. We can map the geology of other planets with exquisite precision, while the geology of the cradle of civilization remains obscured by conflict and neglect. Some researchers have suggested that this is more than coincidence, that there are forces, whether governmental, institutional, or even stranger, that have an interest in ensuring that certain sites remain unexcavated. Certain questions remain unanswered. This may be paranoid speculation, or it may be pattern recognition. Either way, the result is the same. The search continues, but it continues under constraints that make success unlikely, at least in the near term. Meanwhile, in universities around the world, a quieter form of investigation proceeds. The translation of tablets that have sat in museum collections for over a century, still unread digital imaging techniques, now allows scholars to work with tablets, virtually rotating them, examining them under different lighting conditions, sharing high-resolution images with colleagues across the globe. Artificial intelligence is being trained to recognize cuneiform signs, to suggest readings, to identify patterns across thousands of texts. Simultaneously, and in this work, new discoveries are being made every year. Tablets that were catalogued long ago as administrative records turn out on closer examination to contain mythological passages. Tablets that seemed too damaged to read yield their secrets to digital enhancement tablets that nobody thought important reveal details that change our understanding of ancient beliefs and practices somewhere. In these collections, there may be tablets that describe the machine more clearly, that give coordinates we can recognize, that explain its function, its purpose, its nature, or perhaps those tablets have already been translated and sit in academic papers that nobody outside a small circle of specialists has ever read. The search is not only physical, it is textual, and the texts may hold keys that we have not yet recognized as keys. At last, we must speak of the people who have never stopped searching, the villagers and farmers and fishermen who live in the regions where the ancient sites lie. These are people whose ancestors lived on this same land when the temples were active, when the priests conducted their rituals, when the gods, according to tradition, still walked among mortals. And they have stories, stories passed down through generations, stories that scholars have collected and catalogued and generally dismissed as folklore. The marsh Arabs speak of places in the wetlands where the water is forbidden, where approaching too close brings sickness or madness, or strange dreams, where the ancestors went to communicate with powers that dwelt below. They call these places by names that translate roughly as the mouth of the deep, or the ear of the earth, or the breathing place. They say that at certain times of year, one can hear sounds from these spots, sounds like heartbeats or breathing, or distant voices speaking words that almost but not quite make sense. The Yazidis of northern Iraq, who practice an ancient syncretic religion with roots that may predate Islam and Christianity, tell stories of underground guardians, beings who were placed in caverns by the original powers to watch over treasures, and devices and secrets that humanity is not ready to possess. They say that these guardians still fulfill their function, that the places they guard are still dangerous, that the devices they protect still operate and will operate until the appointed time when those who placed them return to reclaim what is theirs. The older people in the villages near Eridu and Ur speak of the singing earth of places, where if you lie down and press your ear to the ground, you can hear a vibration, a constant low-frequency tone that rises and falls like breath. They have names for these places, and they warn their children away from them. Not because they believe in ancient gods, but because experience has taught them that approaching these spots brings headaches and nausea and a sense of dread that cannot be easily explained. Scientists would point to infrasound, nay to electromagnetic fields, to the psychological effects of suggestion and expectation, and these explanations may be correct, but they do not explain why the stories are so consistent, why they correlate so precisely with locations identified in ancient texts as sacred or forbidden, or associated with the underground realm of Enki. Why generation after generation has told the same tales about the same specific places, unless something about those places is genuinely different, genuinely anomalous, genuinely worth remembering, across 4,000 years of human history. The search continues in dusty archives where tablets wait to be read in laboratories, where new technologies promise to reveal what eyes cannot see. In the memories of villagers who carry ancient knowledge without knowing its significance, in the dreams of researchers who believe that answers lie just beneath the surface. If only we could dig deep enough, look carefully enough, listen closely enough. Perhaps one day the political situation will stabilize and the excavations will resume in earnest. Perhaps the technology will advance to the point where we can see through earth and stone as clearly as through glass. Perhaps a farmer digging a well or a construction worker laying pipe will break through into a chamber that changes everything. Perhaps a scholar working through yet another box of uncatalogued tablets will find the text that finally provides coordinates that we can recognize and follow. Perhaps the marsh Arabs will decide to share more of what they know to guide someone to the place where the waters glow and the earth hums, and something waits below the sands of Iraq, blow across the tells tonight as they have blown. For 6,000 years beneath those sands, the secrets of Sumer lie buried temples and palaces, and ordinary homes, and perhaps something else. Something that the scribes described in their careful wedge-shaped marks. Something that has been running in darkness since before the flood, since the gods walked the earth, since the beginning of everything we call civilization. The search is not over. It has barely begun, and somewhere, perhaps very near, perhaps impossibly far, the machine continues its work waiting, as it has always waited for someone to find it and understand at last what the Anunnaki left behind. Let us now gather what we have learned on this long journey through time and text and sand, for we have traveled far together, from the first light of dawn over the Mesopotamian plain to the depths of ancient archives where clay tablets have waited millennia to speak their secrets. We began with a question, a whisper of something impossible, and we followed that whisper through the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform, through the strange vocabulary of the Akkadian scribes, through the stories of beings called the Anunnaki, who descended from the heavens in ages so remote that even the oldest civilizations we know were still unborn. The texts we have examined are not singular or isolated. They are multiple, they are consistent, they appear across different periods and different cities and different scribal traditions, and yet they speak of the same things, the same beings, the same technologies, the same machine left running in the darkness beneath the earth. The translations we have explored are not fanciful inventions of modern dreamers. They are legitimate readings of ancient words, interpretations that scholars have debated for over a century. And while mainstream archaeology has preferred the metaphorical and the mythological, the technological readings remain valid, remain possible, remain haunting in their specificity. The Anunnaki themselves, as we have seen, were not described as ethereal spirits or abstract forces. They were physical beings with physical needs, beings who ate and drank and argued and loved and built, beings who arrived and who departed, beings who left instructions and promises, and, according to the texts, at least one device that would continue their work in their absence. The location of this device, this machine, this heart that beats without blood, has been narrowed by researchers who have traced the geographic clues in the tablets, who have followed the references to the Abzu, to the underground waters, to the temples built over sacred points where heaven and earth were said to connect. And while we cannot stand before you tonight and point to a map and say, here is where it waits, we can say that the search has been focused, that certain sites in southern Iraq, beneath the mounds of Eridu and in the unexplored depths of the marshlands, remain places of profound interest and profound mystery. The anomalies we have documented are genuine. They are not inventions or exaggerations. The unusual acoustic properties of ancient temples, the geomagnetic variations at sacred sites, the underground chambers detected by modern instruments but never excavated, the persistent reports from workers and villagers of humming earth and forbidden zones. These are facts that mainstream science has not adequately explained, facts that linger at the edges of our understanding, like shadows that will not quite resolve into familiar shapes. And the traditions, the oral histories passed down through generations of marsh dwellers and mountain people and desert nomads, these too are real. These too are specific. These too speak of something beneath the ground that has been there since the time of the gods, something that was not made by human hands, something that waits. This is what we know, or rather, this is what the evidence suggests. For in matters such as these, certainty is a luxury we cannot afford, and perhaps should not desire. Now let us consider, in this gentle hour, what it would mean if the machine were found. What implications would ripple outward from such a discovery, touching every aspect of how we understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. If there exists beneath the sands of Iraq a functioning device built by beings who visited Earth thousands of years before our recorded history, then we must reconsider everything we believe about ancient engineering, for such a machine would represent technological capabilities that we have long insisted did not exist in the ancient world. Capabilities involving materials and energy sources and mechanical principles that our textbooks say were not developed until recent centuries. And yet, there it would be, humming in the darkness, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than any human construction we have ever dated. The historical implications would be equally profound, for if the Anunnaki were real, if they truly came from elsewhere and seeded human civilization with knowledge and structure and purpose, then the story we tell ourselves about our own origins, about the long, slow climb from savagery to sophistication, would need to be rewritten entirely. We would not be self-made creatures who pulled ourselves up by our own efforts. We would be inheritors, students, children of a parent civilization whose motives and methods remain largely unknown to us. The spiritual implications are perhaps the most delicate to consider, for billions of people around the world have built their lives and their hopes upon religious traditions that speak of divine beings who created and guided humanity. And if those divine beings were physical visitors with physical technology, what happens to faith? What happens to prayer? What happens to the sense of transcendent mystery that has sustained human hearts through every darkness and every trial? Some would say that such a discovery would destroy religion, would reduce the sacred to the mechanical. But others might say that it would expand our understanding of the divine, that gods who build machines are no less worthy of wonder than gods who perform miracles, that the universe grows only more magnificent when we discover new layers of its complexity. The scientific implications would challenge our understanding of physics and energy and the very nature of matter. For a machine that has run for thousands of years without apparent maintenance or fuel source would require principles we have not yet mastered, would suggest that the ancients or their teachers knew things about the fabric of reality that we are only beginning to glimpse in our most advanced laboratories and theoretical frameworks. And then there is the question that hovers over all others, the question that would face any expedition that actually located and accessed such a device. What do we do with it? Do we study it? Do we attempt to understand its purpose? Do we try to communicate with it or through it? Do we leave it running as it has run since before the flood? Or do we, in our curiosity and our hubris, attempt to turn it off? And if we turn it off, what stops? What fails? What balance is disrupted in ways we cannot predict or repair? Perhaps the machine is doing something essential, something we cannot see or measure. Perhaps it is maintaining some equilibrium in the earth or the atmosphere or the fabric of space itself. Perhaps the Anunnaki left it running not as a gift, but as a necessity, a load-bearing pillar in a structure we do not know we inhabit. And to remove it or disable it might bring consequences more terrible than any ancient flood. Or perhaps, and this too must be considered, the machine is waiting for something, waiting for a signal or a key, or a carrier of the right genetic markers, waiting for the return of its makers, waiting to transmit a message, or open a gateway, or begin some process that has been paused for 6,000 years. And if we find it, if we activate something we do not understand, we may set in motion events that will transform human history in ways both wonderful and terrifying. These are the implications that hover over this mystery. These are the weights that press upon any serious consideration of what the Akkadian texts describe. And they are heavy enough to give anyone pause. Heavy enough perhaps to explain why mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to pursue these questions too vigorously. For there are some doors that, once opened, cannot be closed, and some knowledge that, once possessed, cannot be unlearned. But let us now return, as all journeys must return, to the place where we began. Let us return to the desert and the dawn and the silence that has held these secrets since before history learned to keep its records. Perhaps, in the end, it does not matter whether the machine is real. Perhaps what matters is that our ancestors believed it was, that they looked at the world around them, a world of inexplicable wonders, a world of structures that should not exist, a world of knowledge that appeared fully formed without the long centuries of trial and error that should have preceded it. and they concluded that something beyond themselves had made it so. They did not have the language of science fiction. They did not speak of technology or engineering or extraterrestrial visitation. They had only the vocabulary of the sacred, and so they called these beings gods. They called their works divine. They called their machines the instruments of heaven. And they wrote it all down, pressing their styluses into wet clay with a faith that is almost heartbreaking. A faith that somehow, someday, someone would read these words and understand. Someone would remember what had been given and what had been lost. Someone would carry the story forward into ages the scribes themselves could not imagine. We are those readers. We are those rememberers. We are the ones who have received the message across the vast gulf of time, and whether we interpret it as myth or history, as metaphor or memory, we cannot deny that it has reached us, that it has stirred something in us, that it has made us wonder. And wonder, perhaps, is the point. Perhaps the machine that the Anunnaki left running is not buried beneath Iraq at all. Perhaps it is buried within us, within the human heart that cannot stop asking questions, within the human mind that cannot stop seeking patterns, within the human spirit that looks up at the stars and feels, against all reason, that we are connected to them, that we came from them, that someday we will return. That machine has never stopped running. It ran in the priests of Eridu who climbed the ziggurats to chart the movements of the planets. It ran in the scribes who recorded the king lists that stretched back before the flood. It ran in the philosophers of Greece who learned from the Babylonians, who learned from the Sumerians. It ran in the astronomers of the Renaissance who rediscovered what had been forgotten. It runs in the scientists of today who peer through telescopes at distant worlds and wonder if life has arisen there as it arose here. It runs in you now, in this moment, as you contemplate these ancient mysteries and feel the pull of questions that have no final answers. The stars that rose over Sumer rise still, the same stars, the same patterns, the same wheeling dance that the Anunnaki mapped and measured and perhaps used to navigate between worlds. The sand that buried the first cities blows across them tonight, as it has for 6,000 years, grain upon grain, century upon century, piling up above whatever lies beneath, keeping it safe, keeping it hidden, keeping it waiting. And somewhere in the world, perhaps in a museum basement, perhaps in an archaeologist's tent, perhaps in the quiet study of a translator working late into the night, someone is looking at a cuneiform tablet and seeing something that others have missed, finding a phrase that unlocks a new understanding, asking a question that has not been asked before. The search continues as it always has, as it always will, because that is what humans do, that is what we cannot help but do, and that is the machine that our makers, whoever or whatever they were, set running in us at the very beginning of our story. And so, we come to the end of this journey, though it is not really an end, for the mystery remains, beautiful and patient and eternal, waiting for the next seeker, the next dreamer, the next child who looks up at the sky and asks where we came from and why we are here. Perhaps one day the sands will shift and reveal what lies beneath. Perhaps one day the political storms that have kept Iraq's archaeological treasures buried and inaccessible will calm, and the excavations will resume in earnest. Perhaps one day we will stand in an underground chamber and see with our own eyes the machine that the Akkadian scribes described. And in that moment, everything will change. Or perhaps the mystery will endure. Perhaps the machine will remain forever just out of reach. A legend, a possibility, a story we tell ourselves in the darkness to remind us that the universe is larger and stranger and more wonderful than we can comprehend. Either way, the story will go on, because stories are what we make when we cannot make sense. And this is a story that humanity has been telling since the first clay tablet was pressed, since the first temple was raised, since the first priest looked at the heavens and felt the presence of something vast and ancient and alive. Sleep now, if you will. Let your eyes grow heavy and your breath grow slow. Let the images of sand and starlight and ancient stone drift through your mind like clouds across a desert sky. Dream of the Anunnaki. Dream of their towers and their machines. Dream of the scribes who loved them and served them and tried so hard to remember them. Dream of the machine that may wait beneath the earth, humming its ancient song to no audience but the darkness, patient beyond all human patience, faithful beyond all human faith. And know that somewhere, in the quiet spaces of the earth and the mind, in the archives and the ruins and the stories passed from grandparent to grandchild, the work continues, the questions persist, the wonder endures. It has always continued. It always will. For this is what it means to be human, to stand between the earth and the stars, to feel the weight of the past and the pull of the future, to know that we do not know, and to keep seeking anyway. Good night, dear traveler. Good night, and dream well. And may the mysteries that have accompanied us on this journey accompany you into whatever dreams await, gentle and strange and full of ancient light.